of what I want to say to you is a little bit closer to home. I'm here to talk about the impact that I believe 9/11 has had on the way you think about foreigners in Europe. Also about the way that we frame policy for immigration into Europe, about the kind of priorities we have for policy after 9/11, and about the very big impact on the lives of foreigners already resident in Europe or those who are trying to enter European territory. First of all, if we look at the impact on discourse, I'm not going to suggest that there wasn't a negative discourse on foreigners in Europe before 9/11. But the thing about the negative discourse on foreigners before 9/11 was that it was largely articulated by parties of the extreme right or fringe followers of the mainstream right or the red top papers, really what we would call the gutter press, I suppose. It wasn't really mainstream. And also it concentrated on the economic threat that foreigners were supposed to pose to European citizens, taking jobs, being a burden on the welfare services, and the kind of threat that some extreme right-wing people thought that foreigners posed to European cultural identity. With 9/11, we get a new dimension coming into the fear of foreigners in Europe. I think the psychological blow of being caught out by what was effectively an unknown enemy was very important for European countries. Now, European countries had been used to looking for terrorism from the extreme right and the extreme left. This new radical Islamic terrorism came out of nowhere. And suddenly, people started to be frightened of foreigners because they might be criminals, they might be terrorists. And we hadn't known it. They're living amongst us and we didn't know it. So foreigners were suddenly represented as a security threat. We call this a discourse of exclusion, and that began to take hold in relation to foreigners. But this time, it wasn't only fringe parties, it wasn't only extreme right parties that were articulating this discourse. It was parties of the mainstream as well. And we saw this change of discourse really filtering through very strongly into policy and legislation in Europe, both at the national level and also at the EU level. At the national level, governments started to frame new anti-terrorism laws that had either a direct or an indirect impact on the lives of foreigners. For example, in direct terms, governments gained new powers to detain and deport foreigners who'd been living quite legally in European countries. And this was justified explicitly by the need to protect the security of European citizens. In the EU, the discourse of exclusion worked its way through so that we get a securitization of policy in Europe, and security concerns began to take priority over humanitarian concerns that had been really the priority before. The impact has been that across the European Union we've got new databases that have been set up to enable member states to track asylum seekers and other foreign incomers and to hold their details for really a very long time and to share that information and to really be very intrusive into the movements of foreigners. Also, the EU's external land border is now patrolled by armed guards with dogs, with heat-detecting technology, with unmanned aerial vehicles to defend against illegal entry. And David, you said you believe that we've got less confidence now in the power of security to protect us. We don't see that in this example. What we see is Europe throwing more and more technology at immigrants as if they were an invading army. We've got what I would call a militarization of immigration policy. So we've got a kind of a fortress Europe in the physical sense as well as in the legal sense. Now, even if you accept that some measures are needed to combat radical Islamist terrorist groups, I'd say that the measures that we've seen aren't really the best or the most appropriate to prevent terrorism. Because what we know about the perpetrators of 9/11 type strikes or inspired strikes is that they're more likely to be homegrown terrorists. They tend to be disenchanted or radicalized second or third generation immigrants who've grown up in European host countries. And these aren't the kind of people who are going to be intercepted through stricter controls on entry to EU territory or dissuaded by additional surveillance at the EU's external border. I think that these measures have had a much greater impact on the lives of innocent people, foreigners living in Europe, than on the criminals that they're supposed to target. They've taken a hammer to crack a nut, as they used to say. I wonder if there's another political agenda at work here. I know that for many years, European governments had wanted to impose greater powers of surveillance and control over asylum seekers and immigrants in Europe. And it seemed to me that the terrorist attacks gave them the excuse they've been waiting for to push forward this kind of measure without being vetoed by more liberal opponents in their parliaments. So who are the losers of this post-9/11 securitisation of immigration policy? Well, it has to be the foreigners. First of all, foreigners who've been resident in European countries, even for a long time, have very often experienced forms of discrimination, but now they're facing a new kind of discrimination because they're coming under a special surveillance in comparison with indigenous or home ethnic communities. The discourse of exclusion, I think, is very uncomfortable for resident foreigners in European countries. They're tarred with the suspicion of potentially being criminals. It's like they've got to prove they're not criminals. So for people already living in European countries, there's a new level of discrimination, a new type of discrimination. But for me, the greatest losers are the most vulnerable foreigners, and those are people who are excluded from legal employment or in marginal employment in their host states. What's happened is, with our current preoccupation with security, relatively little attention is being paid to the humanitarian aspects of European immigration policy. One problem for me is that most of our immigration policy works on the assumption that migrants all line up neatly at European checkpoints, and they also report to the national authorities and have their documentation checked. But the most vulnerable and the most vilified foreigners in Europe are illegals, and their lives have become very much more dangerous as a result of this twin shift towards more repressive security measures and measures to protect only the legal foreign workers in Europe. Until very recently, our policies have overlooked entirely the people who are voluntarily trafficked or paid to be smuggled into Europe, or involuntarily trafficked and exploited in Europe in dangerous and degrading activities. Our policies have overlooked the thousands of semi-legal or illegal domestic workers in private houses. European legislation can protect people who are employed by businesses and corporations, but it's very hard to spot people who are being exploited in private homes. So I think that rather than effectively criminalising foreigners, Europe needs to crack down on those commercial interests and individuals who are exploiting illegal and semi-legal immigrants and workers. And what 9/11 has done, in my view, is directed our attention away from this very important problem.